You know, there's a couple components that you have to have when you're flipping heavy cover with a jig. The first is you need a high quality, high speed reel. This is a LEW'S Super Duty, 8-3-1. I always want a fast reel anytime I'm flipping or pitching. And the big reason for that is where I can pick up slack quickly and I can be really efficient by getting that bait in and getting it back out there. That high speed reel helps that. And also when you're fishing shallow, heavy cover, those fish have a tendency to move real fast. And that way I can always keep the line tight and there's no chance of that fish ever getting slack. Now rod wise, these are my LEW'S Signature Series. I have two. I have a 7.6, what I call a pitching rod, and then I have a 7.11 flipping stick. They are both great rods for flipping and pitching. One is considerably heavier than the other. The 7.6 is probably the rod I fish with the most because of most situations that we go to. When the cover is not extremely heavy, like I'm pitching cypress trees, I'm pitching boat docks. It can even be a situation where I'm using fluorocarbon. I always use that 7.6. Now that 7.6 is still a big rod, but it's a real accurate rod, an easy rod to fish with. It's definitely not an overpowering rod. When you pick it up, it just fits in your hand perfect. It's a heavy / medium heavy type tip because that's very important when I'm pitching a bait around. I like enough tip to carry the bait, but that's where all your sensitivity is in the end. So sparser cover, cypress trees, boat docks, pitching the edge of reeds, that situation when you're going from braid to fluorocarbon or vice versa, when you want a little, what I call a little more finesse, my version of finesse flipping, which is still power fishing, I always reach for that 7.6. Now in situations where we're going in heavy, big lure, 3/4 ounce or heavier, always that 7.11. And the main reason for that is you need enough rod when you go to a big weight not to be overpowered by the weight of the lure. So anytime I'm using a 3/4 or heavier, I always reach for that 7.11. It's balanced perfect and it'll just not work you as hard when you're fishing that heavy lure. And it's more times maybe I'm flipping deep grass, places where I need lots of power, pulling fish out of mats, heavy lily pads, extremely heavy cover. I'm always going to reach for that 7.11. So just think about this. That 7.6 is what I consider my plinking rod. Every day flipping and pitching, that's the rod I'm going to go with every time. It's just perfect. Again, you can use it with fluorocarbon or braid, but when we're in that heavy cover situation, I'm always going to go with the 7.11 Hackney Signature Series. Those are just the two rods that I'm going to use anytime I'm flipping a jig, flipping plastic. Just think big weight, 7.11, lighter weights, 3/4 or less, 7.6. Perfect. So when I'm swimming a jig, it's a totally different setup from when I'm flipping a jig. So swimming a jig, I want a rod that's much softer. And because you're fishing a lot of times I'm fishing that swim jig at a high rate of speed. I also like a bigger reel because it holds a lot of line. You're making a lot of long casts. I'll use the heavy duty when I'm flipping, the small 100 heavy duty when I'm flipping. But when I'm casting, I do all of my casting with a BB1 Pro. Speed wise, typically I got two different speeds. I use a 7.5-1 if the water's colder and I'm fishing that swim jig slower, and an 8.3-1 when I'm fishing at an extremely high rate of speed. But the BB1 Pro has a wide spool. And the reason I like the wide spool is when you make a long cast, you lose a lot of line. The reel has a tendency to keep that faster speed. When I'm plinking or flipping and pitching, that's all done close. So you're using basically somewhere between 10 and 30 foot of line. Well, when I'm casting that swim jig, I'll probably be throwing it 60 yards. And so I like a big spool. That BB1 has a big spool, big handles. It's a powerful reel, it's fast. But the other deal is I want a rod with a soft tip. I typically go with two different swim jig rods. I use my 7.3 frog rod if the cover's not too heavy and I'm not making extra long casts. But in situations like here we are in Florida and I'm gonna throw a swim jig, I'm actually got a KVD 7.6. It's a soft 7.6 rod, got a lot of tip. It's definitely more of a parabolic medium heavy. It's not a fast rod. I like it here just because the cover is really heavy and I'm making extremely long casts and I like that extra length. But most of the time I like the 7.3 frog rod. It's plenty rod for swimming a jig. But again, think about it. You want a soft tip, braided line 99% of the time. About the only time that I don't use braid when swimming a jig is when I'm fishing a swim jig down deep, slow rolling it. You know, I'll reach for fluorocarbon. It's a moving bait. There's not much opportunity. I'm worried about the fish seeing the line because you're throwing it in heavy cover most of the time, and there's just not much opportunity for that fish to see it. So a soft rod, braided line, BB1 Pro. 7.5 to 1 if you need a slower gear ratio. If you're burning that thing through cover, an 8.3 to 1. That's the setup I use on a swim jig.